It was a late Friday afternoon when we made our decision. My two closest friends, Eli and Noah, and I had been planning something like this for weeks. We were college students, living in the heart of the city, and our free time was rare. When we weren't studying or working, we were exploring. We'd hit abandoned houses, decaying parks, even forgotten tunnels underneath the city. But this was going to be something different. Eli had heard about it first. An abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, hidden from most people's knowledge. It had been closed down for years after a fire, and rumors swirled that it had been the site of some dark history. Some said the workers who had perished in the blaze still roamed the halls. Others claimed that something far worse was now lurking within. But we didn't care. We weren't afraid of ghosts or rumors. The challenge was what excited us. The adrenaline of sneaking into a place no one had dared to in years was our idea of fun. That Friday, we packed a small bag of essentials, flashlights, water, a couple of snacks, and headed out. Eli drove us to the outskirts of town, past the familiar city streets, until we entered an area where the houses became more spaced out, and the land seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The factory wasn't far from there. When we arrived, we were met with an eerie silence. There were no cars around, no sign of anyone. The factory loomed before us, a massive structure of steel and brick, its windows shattered, its roof caved in at places. It was as if time had forgotten this place completely. We parked in a small clearing by the side of the road, and the moment we stepped out of the car, the wind picked up. It carried a cold, metallic scent, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. "Are we really doing this?" Noah asked, looking uncertain. I laughed, trying to mask my own nervousness. "We've been through worse, right? Let's just check it out. If it's as bad as they say, we'll leave." Eli nodded in agreement and led the way. We climbed over a rusted chain-link fence, its barbed wire long neglected. The factory was silent. No sounds of birds, no wind whistling through the trees. Just stillness. We moved carefully through the overgrown grass toward the massive entrance. The door, a large metal slab, was ajar. A light push and it creaked open, revealing the dark, decaying interior. The air inside was thick, damp, and smelled of rust and decay. It felt oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. "Shh," Eli whispered. "Listen." We all paused. The silence was absolute. No creaks, no sounds, nothing. "Okay," Noah muttered. "That's freaky." We pushed further into the building, using the weak beams of light from our flashlights to navigate the darkness. The main hall was enormous, filled with rows of rusted machines that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Piles of broken crates and debris scattered across the floor, making it hard to move without stepping on something. "Let's split up," Eli suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way. Just stay within shouting distance." "Yeah, all right," I agreed reluctantly. Noah wasn't happy about the idea, but he didn't argue. The place was so large, we figured it'd be easier to explore if we divided and conquered. We went in different directions. I walked down a narrow corridor that led deeper into the building. The walls were covered in peeling paint and black mold. The further I went, the more unsettling it became. The factory was completely dark except for the beam of my flashlight, which seemed weak in comparison to the shadows stretching endlessly around me. I came to a large room filled with old equipment. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was cracked and uneven. I was about to turn around when I heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum, coming from the far end of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I listened again, but the sound stopped. I tried to dismiss it as just the building settling. But then I heard it again, this time louder, unmistakable. It was footsteps. I quickly turned and shined my light in the direction of the sound. Nothing. The room was empty. "Guys?" I called out, but my voice echoed emptily in the vast space. "Eli? Noah?" No answer. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sense of unease creeping over me. I turned and started walking back toward the entrance, but the footsteps continued. Closer now, echoing in the distance. I picked up my pace, but the sound seemed to follow me. Every time I stopped, they stopped. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice trembling slightly. There was no response. Suddenly, the door I had passed through slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, making me jump. I turned to find the room completely dark, except for my flashlight. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I fumbled with my phone to call Eli or Noah, but before I could dial, I heard a voice, faint at first, like a whisper, but unmistakable. "Leave now," it said. I froze. The voice was low, grating, and filled with malice. "Who are you?" I shouted, but no one answered. Instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, this time closer than ever. Panic surged through me. I bolted toward the door, only to find it was now locked from the outside. My heart raced as I banged on it, shouting for help. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were behind me now, and I could hear them getting closer, echoing in the hall. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the wall, and I could hear breathing. I turned quickly, the light of my flashlight flickering, revealing nothing but the empty room. "Guys!" I screamed again, but my voice was almost lost in the echoing silence. I finally managed to get the door open, bursting out into the hallway. As I ran toward the exit, I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one. I didn't stop running until I was outside, into the cold night air, where I finally collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. Eli and Noah came rushing up to me, both looking confused and concerned. "What happened?" Eli asked. I think someone was in there with me," I gasped. "But I didn't see anyone. The doors, the footsteps. Something was following me." We didn't stick around to investigate any further. We left the factory behind, our curiosity completely extinguished by the overwhelming sense of dread that had followed us the entire time. To this day, I don't know what I heard or what I felt in that factory. But I do know one thing. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some doors should never be opened. It was 2 years ago when I first heard the whispers about the Holloway house, the old, abandoned mansion at the edge of town. No one had lived there for decades, and over time, the locals had made up all sorts of stories about it. The house had stood still in time, its wood decaying, windows shattered, and vines creeping up its walls like the fingers of some unseen creature. But I was different. I didn't believe in ghosts or legends. I had an inexplicable urge to visit, to see for myself. Everyone said it was dangerous, that the house had a curse, but I didn't care. I wanted to know if the stories were true, or if it was just a bunch of scared townspeople making things up. One late afternoon, I found myself walking down the forgotten path that led to the Holloway house. The grass had overrun the driveway, and trees loomed above like a dark canopy, blocking out much of the setting sun. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The wind was strangely still. As I approached, the house looked even worse than I remembered. Its windows were nothing but dark holes, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. No one had bothered to board it up, or even warn people away. With nothing but my flashlight and my phone, I stepped inside. The air was musty, and the floorboards creaked beneath my weight. It felt like stepping into the past. Old furniture sat untouched. A sofa in the living room, torn and rotting. A fireplace with cold ashes scattered around, and shattered picture frames strewn across the floor. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I walked deeper into the house, but I ignored it. I was here to explore, not to be scared. I ventured into the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. As I reached the stairs, I hesitated. The staircase was steep, its wood weak from years of neglect. But my curiosity won out, and I began to climb. The second floor was just as eerie as the first. There were 2 rooms. One was open, the other closed. I approached the open room first. It was empty, save for a dusty rug in the center and a broken chair lying on its side. I moved my flashlight over the walls, tracing the decay. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from below. My heart skipped a beat. I turned toward the stairs, but everything was silent again. I stood there for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. There was no way anyone else was in the house. I was alone, right? I quickly turned and made my way down the stairs, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But when I reached the bottom, the front door was shut, locked. I could feel panic starting to creep up my spine. The door had been wide open when I came in. I hadn't closed it. I rushed over and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had somehow sealed itself off. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I ran to the nearest window and tried to push it open, but it was stuck, the frame painted shut with years of grime. I could hear my breath growing shallow as I tried to force the window open, but it was useless. I was trapped. That's when I heard something that froze me in place. A voice. It wasn't loud or aggressive, more like a soft whisper, but I could hear it clearly. Leave. I spun around, my flashlight darting around the room, but no one was there. There was nothing but the oppressive silence. The voice echoed in my mind, but I couldn't figure out where it came from. Leave. It was coming from upstairs. My legs felt like lead as I slowly started making my way back up the stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. The air was colder now. My breath was visible in the dim light as I reached the top. I stood still for a moment, straining to listen. There was a sound, scratching. I turned toward the closed room at the end of the hall. The scratching sound grew louder as I moved closer, the air growing thicker with every step. I reached for the door, my hand shaking. And then, before I could even turn the knob, The door burst open with a violent bang, knocking me back. I stumbled into the hallway, my heart racing. I couldn't move. The room was empty, but it was as if something had been there, like a presence had just left. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward me. I looked around, but there was nowhere to hide. The steps came closer, the sound of them echoing in the narrow corridor. My body was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then I saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, looming, its form barely visible in the shadows. But what stood out most was its face. It was mine. A perfect, exact replica of my face, twisted in a grotesque smile. The eyes, they weren't mine. They were dark, hollow, empty. My heart hammered in my chest. I had to leave. I ran to the nearest window and threw myself through it. My body crashed into the ground below, and I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. I ran blindly through the woods, my flashlight turned off, trying to stay out of sight. My feet tangled in the underbrush, and the woods felt like they were closing in on me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw lights, red and blue, flashing lights, cutting through the darkness. The police were here. I ducked behind a tree, watching as 2 police cars drove up to the house. They didn't see me. They passed right by, moving quickly toward the front of the house. I had no idea what they were doing there. Who could be inside the house? And why did it feel like they were in such a hurry? I waited for a few minutes, watching them. But when I looked back, the house was gone. The clearing was empty. The house had vanished. It didn't make sense. I couldn't explain it. I tried to find answers, but no one seemed to know anything about what had happened that night. There were no reports, no records of police activity at the house. But every now and then, when I pass that way again, I still feel it. The sensation that something is watching me. And every so often, in the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something standing in the trees, and it looks just like me.